Everyone, I'm Allie with Potomac Beads, and I'm going to show you how to create these everyday earrings. They're called everyday earrings because it's a pearl, it's a crystal, they all go together, they're encapsulated by seed beads. If you ever need any materials, go ahead and look below the video. In the description of the video, we'll put links there to get back to our website and check it all out. Gather up your supplies and let's get started. So to begin, we're going to be bezeling our 10mm Rivoli. The 10mm Rivoli will sit at the bottom of the pearl, and you're just going to learn the technique to basically combine the two. You don't have to have it on the bottom of pearl. You can directly connect to the piece, but this shows you how to stack one on the other. The first thing we're doing is going to wrap our 10mm Rivoli in a peyote bezel. If you're not sure exactly how many beads you need and want to start a peyote bezel for a different sign Rivoli, you can go to our website and go to the very bottom blog. There's a blog there that talks all about bezeling Rivolis and gives you the exact number that you need. So I know already without having to try that I have a 10mm Rivoli. I need 26 Delica beads. I have 26 Delica beads on some size 8 dragon thread. I'm going with a green color since I have a green crystal and I'm working with some green 15s as well. The first thing I'm going to do is tie the loop of 26 beads into a knot. Now, some people do not care to do a knot when they're doing a bezel like this for Rivoli. When it's something small like this, I don't mind. I'm going to make sure no beads get caught in my secondary knot there. That wants to get caught. Tie and pull nice and tight. And then what we're going to do is sew away from the knot. So I'm going to take my thread and needle and I'm going to sew into the next 2 beads away from that knot. Now, in my sample piece, I'm going to do another row of my peyote stitch, which is going to be a 3rd row and then a 4th row here of my Delica beads. If you want to do 3 rows, you don't have to do the 4. That's kind of up to you. I went for it and did the 4 rows. 3 would fit nicely as well too. Now that we have 26 beads in here, we're going to do 2 more rows that only have 13, half that amount. To do the peyote stitch, our thread is currently coming out of our row of seed beads, and I'm out there through what I'm going to call bead number 1. I'm going to skip over bead number 2 and sew into bead number 3. What will happen in that case then is bead number 2 will sit, that I just added. The bead I just added will sit nicely on top of bead number 2. Add another bead, skip over bead number 4 there because I'm coming out 3, and I'm going to sew into bead number 5. I'm always going to be skipping the evens and sewing through the odds. Add another bead, skip over the next one in line, go through number 7. Add a bead, skip over 8, go through 9. As you do this and progress around, you will have added 13 beads onto that peyote stitch. It'll go from laying nice to the side to sitting straight up so that way you see it on the side of the piece. When we get back to the middle then, you want to make sure to just kind of give a nice tight pull as you're sewing through that middle bead. It will again look like a stack up brick wall, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Keep looking and making sure, and then make sure at the final count that you've added your 13 beads to what is actually called row 3 of the peyote stitch. Rows 1 and 2 were the 26 beads that we originally put on. Row 3 is the 13 that we're adding now. Once you've put that 13th bead on here, you're coming out of the last bead, which is going to be the 26th bead. I don't need to put another bead because I already completed that row when I started and added my first one. But what we're going to do is called a step up. I'm going to step up into bead number 1 from that 3rd row of peyote that I just finished. Now again, if you want to, you can switch right into the 15s if you don't want it to be quite as thick. Because I did the sample as 4 rows, I'm going to do a 4th row here as well of my Delicas. Grabbing 1 Delica now and going through bead number 2 of my last row of peyote stitch. Grabbing a Delica, sewing through bead number, that would be number 1, bead number 2, bead number 3, bead number 4. As you're doing this again, you want to, when you get back to that center bead, give a nice tight pull. It'll start to stick up on its end, and you're adding an additional 13 beads here. After we finish this 4th row, we're going to go in and we're going to add a 5th and a 6th row of 15-0 seed beads to get the front of our peyote bezel here. As I'm finishing this last row here of my Delica beads in the 11 seed bead. I'm adding my last and final 13th one to the row number 4. And at the same time, I went through row number 3 through bead number 1 and stepped up through bead number 1 of row 4 that I just added. So I'm coming out of that row number 4, bead number 1, and now we're going to switch into 15 O's. So we're going to take a 15 O. We're going to sew through the next bead from the previous row that is sticking up. I'm turning it on the side here so you can see a little bit how that's getting added. Biggest thing that I've noticed when you're doing this is sometimes the thread gets twisted around the bead when you go from bigger to smaller. Just make sure when you're looking at your beads that you do not have thread actually twisted around the bead. We're taking our bead and we're going into the next bead, adding a 15 O, and it's just like the same, going through, adding the bead, pulling tightly. When you pull again, you do not want to pull the needle, you want to pull the thread. So give a nice tight pull and pull that thread. Going in here, once I have 13 of these added, I'm going to show you that we are going to add another row, but it's not until the next row is added that I'm going to pick up the Rivoli and drop it in. So you may be very tempted to pick up the Rivoli and kind of hold it in place. I don't really worry about that much at all. The bottom of your bezel is going to be already fairly tight. Because it is fairly tight is because you tied a knot, getting those first 26 beads on. If you used a stop bead instead of a knot, you're not going to notice as much. See that kind of cupping at the back there? You're not going to notice that as much. Once I get that last bead in, I'm going to step up, finishing off, adding the last bead, and stepping up into that first green bead, that first 15 O that I just added from that row. Push those beads in, pull my thread, not my needle, grab my crystal. It's going to pop out the back, but I like to have it in place there to kind of push all the beads towards the front. So now going around one more time, 15 goes on into the next 15 O seed bead. 15 on, and you're just spinning around in a circle, then adding on that final row of 15 towards the front. See how my crystal is going out the back because the back's not tight yet. Some people will make the back first, some people will make the front first. I prefer, if the knot is there, to make the front first, so that way my thread and needle is away from the knot. As I'm going here, I'm going to grab my thread, pull nice and tight to pull that in towards the middle, because the 15 O's are smaller than the Delica 11s, which is why it's creating that nice bezeled center period and portion and going right in. I'm also using a color that matches my crystal Rivoli, so that way it appears that the crystal is bigger and I'm not losing as much of that Rivoli doing the bezel. As you finish this second round of your 15 O Delica bead or 15 O seed beads, you could use 15 O Delicas too if you want. You're going in, and I want to finish the stitch. So I'm going back into the first bead there, which would finish it. I'm stepping up still, pushing all of that towards the center, just see with my fingers, putting in the Rivoli now along the back. Oops. Kind of pressing in there. Sometimes you'll need to like pull up the crystals a little bit, or not the crystals, the Delica beads. I'm pulling the thread nice and tight. Then I'm going to go down into the first row of the 15s. I'm going to go into the fourth, third, first, or second and first row of my Delica beads. And notice how I went on an angle. The fine line between getting nice and close photos here with the fuzziness of it. But I went on a diagonal from the front to the back. Give a nice tight pull that locks that center in place, and then I will go back and reinforce it if you want to, but notice how it's not quite sitting exactly symmetrical. That'll happen as we do the back. So along the back now, we're doing the same thing. In goes a Delica bead, or out goes my threads coming out of a Delica, I add a 15. And here is where I am putting that crystal in place, using my fingers to kind of massage it in place and add that first row of my 15 O's. After the first row of the 15 O's, just like we did along the front, we're going to add a second row of 15 O's. The whole time as we're going around, kind of pinching our Delicas so that we end up with like a tire wheel around our crystal, pushing it, making sure that it sits even on both sides. After you get done your second row, your Rivoli is in there nice and tight. It's up to you whether or not you want to go around again. What I'm going to do is just take my thread and needle, not taking and adding any beads. And because I have the green thread with my green beads, I'm just sewing right through that last row of 15s, bringing them even closer into the center without adding any beads in between. So I'll see a little bit of thread, but it's on the back, and really it helps to pull it nice and tight. And I'm not worrying about that. So going around here, pulling nice and tight, kind of bending that in towards the center. Same deal, nice and tight. Bending it in towards the center, giving a nice tight pull. From here, when you flip over, your Rivoli should look perfectly in the middle there. And we are going to get to the top to add our pearl into place. It's almost reversible too if you want to with that pearl on the top, but I want to show you how to add just a bead to the top. So I'm coming out of the last row there of my 15 O's, completing that loop that I've created. I'm going to back up. So I'm going to go through the first row of the Delica beads, reversing the thread there. The thread was coming toward me. It is now going away from me. That kind of reverses and locks it in. And I'm coming out of one of my second row of my Delica beads. Now, you have to decide kind of where you want this to come out. There's 3 rows. There's 1 row, 2 row, 3, and 4. So in the sample piece, I came out the 3rd row. So I'm coming out the second one basically from the front. So I'm going to sew in and go through that front middle one. So I'm on row 2, first row, second row. Coming out of row 2, I'm going to add 1 15-0. I'm going to pick up one of my pearls and I'm going to sew through. So let's get this pearl out here. And I'm using an 8mm pearl, but you can use basically whatever size you want. Going through the pearl, adding a 15, grabbing a wire guard, because you don't have to decorate the top much at all. Going down through the wire guard. If I'm not adding any beads, I want to pinch the wire guard and share the 15. Since I am adding beads, I'm adding a 15 and sewing down through the pearl. Making sure that sits nicely. Add a 15. And now the Delica bead that your thread is currently coming out of when you added that 15 seed bead, I'm going to sew into that same bead, but from the opposite direction. So my thread was coming out the right. I added the 15 and the 8mm pearl, the top, and then I'm coming into the opposite side. So they sit right next to one another. I'm going to go through that first 15 on the bottom that is next to the pearl. And then I'm going to add a total of 9 of my Delica beads around the pearl. So there's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Adding those in, I'm going to sew up through the 15 seed bead that's there before the wire guard. I'm going to sew through the wire guard, reinforcing my thread and needle. I'm going through the 15. It doesn't want to go through the wire guard at the same time, so I'm going to go through it on its own. Making sure whenever you reinforce that your thread stays in that wire guard. I'm going to go through the 15 after the wire guard as well and bring my thread and needle out. Pinch that, making sure that thread goes in, making sure that it sits exactly the same, grabbing more of my Delica beads. And once again, adding 9 on the second side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 get added. And I'm going to sew into that bottom 15-0. Sew into the Delica bead right after it, because we're reinforcing it there. So into the 15 first. That brings that Delica design from the bottom to the top. You don't have to do the green on the top. It's up to you. After you sew through that 15, again, sew through the Delica and just the Delica, that's the connector right there. And now we're going to add some peyote stitch, just like we did along the bottom. So our peyote stitch along the bottom here, I want you to go through the 15 before the first row of Delicas. So the 15 that sits before the pearl. I want you then to go through Delica number 1 of the 9. We're doing an odd count peyote here. And we're going to add 15 O's between, like a Delica style. On goes a 15, skip over bead number 2, go through bead number 3. Keep these 15s to the front of the project. Add a bead, skip through, skip over bead number 4, sew through 5. Again, push that towards the front and give a nice tight pull. On goes our bead. On goes the seed bead. On goes another seed bead up into that first delicate bead. Once I'm through that first delicate bead, we're going to hop over to the other side. And how are we hopping? We're going to go from our 15 at the base here, up through the 15. I'm not going to bother with the wire guard because I've already reinforced it. And then I'm going to go down through the 15 on the opposite side. It pulls it a little bit towards the front, but that's the effect that we want. Go through the first of your delicate bead here and continue that peyote stitch on the opposite side with your 15 O's, just like it is. As we get to the front here, you can, if you want to, go down back through the beads. I kind of closed up the bezel by coming out through the last 11 O delica, adding 3 11 O delicas, and then going to that delica on the side there. What that did is kind of closed up that gap, but you can go right over if you want to keep a little bit of that green exposed. From here, I'm sewing up through my first one of my green 15-0, and then going to do the peyote on the side too here. 115 through peyote, or through bead number 2, 15 through bead number 3, 15 through bead number 4, and then at the top here, scooting around and continuing the same thing to the bottom to close up the look of those seed beads around the outer edge. Once you finish the first side with that second row of your 15-0 peyote stitch, which is, again, just 3 beads because we did 4 originally, I just went right along the top again, came out the side, and then did 3 more on the opposite side, came through to the bottom, went up to the top of the piece, and went through the seed bead, or went through the pearl, and then we're weaving our thread back down towards the bottom, very, very simply going through and looking at the opportunity there for us to get those thread ends together if you want to tie them off here. The other way, if you don't have a thread end to get rid of your thread when it comes to peyote stitch, that you don't see it and you don't need to tie a knot or anything like that, is to go in and reverse the thread several times. So what I mean by reversing the thread is my thread is currently going towards the left. And what I'm going to do is reverse the thread by stepping back 2 rows of peyote, which is going to be the peyote that sits right next to that bead, one kind of on top of the other. And then I'm going to go back the opposite way. Going to sew a couple beads, go back the opposite way. Sew a couple beads, go back the opposite way. What that basically does is locks it in place. After doing so, which I already did more of those, I burn down the thread ends with my thread burner, flush towards the project, making sure I don't burn anything or mess up the pearl coating there by burning it. Burn it nice and tight down flush to the project. Grab your ear wire. You're going to take your needle nose or chain nose pliers, just open up that ear wire, pop that guy on, close it up, and there you have your matching little set of earrings. Remember, with this, so much variation can be done that you can go in and you can change the bottom, the top, use it to just help coat the beads on the side, or do the whole bezel, or continue on. I actually had and went back and forth about adding some of the crystal drops as well to the bottom, but decided to keep them nice and simple. Thanks so much for joining me to create these everyday earrings. Remember, you can make them look really sophisticated with all gold seed beads or silver seed beads, crystal and pearls, different colors as well, and even stretch it down further, adding a loop. This is just the beginning, and hopefully you learned those basics. Remember, if you need any Rivolis or crystals or any glass pearls or even delicas or 15s, go ahead and look below the video. In the description, we have links for everything there to get back to our website so you can grab your supplies easily in one place. As always, too, hit that little subscribe button so you don't miss anything from us here at Potomac Beads. Thank you guys so much for watching Potomac Beaters, and stay tuned for more inspirational designs.